Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hope in a little while to be joined by some of my colleagues. Mr. Speaker, as the only independent in the Congress, I think what disturbs me most about much of the dialogue which takes place here is in fact that the most important issues facing the American people, the reality of life in our country today, is simply not talked about enough. Every day there are heated debates that take place here, and charges and countercharges, all kinds of issues are raised. But sometimes I think that the reality of American life as it exists today really is not adequately addressed. And before we get into the issue of the budget, which I want to get into, and I hope some of my colleagues will be getting into with me as well, let's talk about reality in America today, a reality that we don't see too much discussed here. We don't see it on CBS too much, or NBC, or the New York Times, or our hometown papers. Mr. Speaker, I would argue that the most important issue facing the American people is that for the middle class of this country, for the average working person of this country, for those tens and tens of millions of people who constitute the vast majority of our citizenry, for those people, this country is becoming a poorer and poorer country. Since 1973, when America reached its pinnacle, its high point in terms of wages and benefits for ordinary working people, since 1973, 80%, 4/5 of the American working people have experienced either a decline in their real wages, in their standard of living, or stagnation. That means they've worked for over 20 years and they look back and they've gotten nowhere in a hurry. That's 80% of the American people. Average weekly earnings from 1978 to 1990 declined, went down by 13.5%. In 1979, the average weekly wage in the United States was $387. 10 years later, in 1989, in terms of real inflation accounted for dollars, that wage had dropped to $335. People are working, their standard of living is in decline. What is perhaps most frightening is that for young workers, their real wages have declined even more. There was a study done not so many months ago which indicated that for young male high school graduates going out into entry-level jobs, young men were earning 30% less than was the case for similar high school graduates just 15 years ago. So when parents look out and they're working hard and they're seeing their standard of living decline, what is even more painful for them as they look out, they're seeing their sons and their daughters going out into jobs which are paying even lower wages. Mr. Speaker, between 1988 and 1993, worker productivity in the private sector increased by 5.9%. That's the good news. The bad news is that during that same period, average hourly earnings declined by 4%. By 1993, the typical family had lost $1,400 of the buying power it had in 1991. Mr. Speaker, one of the frustrations, we talk about why the American people are angry, why the American people are frustrated. A study done by Juliet Shaw, who was then at Harvard University, indicated that for American workers to maintain their standard of living, they had to be working now an extra 1 month a year, either in overtime or in second jobs. And in my state of Vermont, it is not uncommon to see people working 3 jobs. Mr. Speaker, 40%, and this is an important fact, we talk about welfare reform, so forth and so on, 40% of the families in America today who live in poverty have a full-time worker. This is not unemployed people. They're not people just sleeping out on the street. And one of the reasons that our low-income workers are doing worse today than they did 20 years ago is that the minimum wage today at a disgracefully low $4.25 an hour has a purchasing power which is 26% lower than it was 20 years ago. Mr. Speaker, we look in the newspapers and they tell us, well, unemployment is not such a serious problem. Maybe it's 5%, maybe it's 6%. Countries all over the world, in Europe, Scandinavia, they have higher rates of unemployment. But I would argue, Mr. Speaker, and I think many of our leading economists would argue, that in real fact, unemployment in America is actually double than what the official statistics tell us. Why is that? Official statistics do not include discouraged workers. That means people are living in communities where there just are no jobs. They don't go out. So therefore, they are not counted as part of the official unemployment statistic. And perhaps even more importantly, part-time workers who want to work full-time are also not included as part of the official unemployment statistic. One of the very frightening aspects of the modern American economy is that when we look at the new jobs that are being created, are they good-paying 40-hour-a-week jobs? No, they're not. Not in Vermont, not in the vast majority of the states in this country. Many of the new jobs that are being created are part-time jobs. You have people who want to work 40 hours a week, but they are getting 20 hours a week without benefits. Are they counted as unemployed? No, they are not. So I would just conclude my initial remarks, Mr. Speaker, welcome Mr. DeFazio here, but just simply say that before we talk about the budget, before we can talk about why the American people are angry, the most important reality is America has the right to be angry. Our people are working longer hours for lower wages, for less vacation time, for fewer benefits than was the case 20 years ago. But on the other hand, there's another reality which is going on. Are all the people in America seeing a decline in their standard of living? Are we all in this boat together? The answer, obviously, is not. Recent study, front page of the New York Times. Richest 1% of the population now owns 40% of the wealth of America. We have the most uneven distribution of wealth in the entire industrialized world. Richest 1% owns more wealth than the bottom 90%. Upper income 4% earns more income than the bottom 51%. And the gap between the rich and the poor grows wider. The middle class continues to shrink. That is the reality of American life today for the middle class, for the working class, for low-income people. Having said that, I'm delighted to welcome, to my mind, certainly one of the outstanding fighters for working people in this Congress, Peter DeFazio of Oregon.
And I guess the follow-up point would be what caused these inequities and what can or should we do about it? I would say, in good part, you can lay the blame for the extraordinary pauperization of the middle class in this country to two major areas of policy, probably three. The tax policy of this country, which has heaped more and more burden on middle-income people and lightened the burden on those at the very top and the largest, most profitable corporations. In fact, the Republican budget which passed the House here would do away with the corporate alternative minimum tax. It means we go back to the days when a corporation like AT&T, as they did from 1981 to 85, can earn $1.3 billion in profits and not only not pay taxes, we all understand about loopholes and avoidance, but actually demand and receive a $200 million tax refund for taxes they did not pay. That is, other Americans, people who worked for wages, went to work every day, paid their taxes, and guess what? Part of their paycheck went to give a $200 million tax giveaway to a corporation which had made $1.4 billion in those same years, and now we're being told that is what will take care of the problems of middle-income Americans. The Republican tax break bill repeals the corporate alternative minimum tax, and that will put Americans back to work at higher wages. Give me a break.
Is the gentleman, let's go over that once again, because people may be adjusting their TV dials here to get that straight. Is the gentleman suggesting that if the Republican proposal here in the House goes into effect, that the largest corporations in America making billions of dollars in profit will pay less in taxes than the average working stiff making $25,000 a year? Is that what the gentleman is saying?
I am saying that will be true, and in fact, if we go back to the pre-alternative corporate minimum tax days, the 1980s, we could say, in fact, that those same working people will pay taxes so that tax credits can flow to those companies. The other issue there would be, of course, that the United States stands alone in the industrial world in not taxing foreign operations in the United States or multinational corporations. We have adopted such a limp section to the code of taxation that virtually every major multinational and foreign corporation in this country pays no income taxes, no matter how profitable they are, because they upstream or downstream their profits to other lower tax countries. They are not paying their fair share. Yet every day, every week, every American sees their taxes go up. They see the deductions out of their paychecks, but no, Honda doesn't make any money in the United States of America. They just sell cars here. Toyota doesn't make money in the United States of America. They just sell cars here. If we adopted the same system of taxation that all of our major trading partners have adopted, the estimates are we could raise $40 to $60 billion next year. That's about a third of the deficit. We could raise it by just taxing the profits of multinational and foreign corporations the same way that every one of our major economic competitors does.
But if I could interrupt the gentleman, wouldn't they be upset? Would they then go to Republican and Democratic fundraising dinners and contribute tens and tens of thousands of dollars? I don't understand what you're saying. If we tax them, how would they contribute huge sums of money to the Republican and Democratic Party? Surely the gentleman must be joking.
Well, perhaps that's the bottom line here is, you know, how the money flows in Washington, D.C., how the influence flows in Washington, D.C. You know, in the office of the Special Trade Representative, a study I saw said that 75% of the people who've worked in the President's office of the Special Trade Representative have become foreign agents. That is, they are now representing foreign nations against the interests of the United States in trade and economic policy. You know, we've got to close these revolving doors. We've got to reform campaign finance. We've got to reform the gift rule, but somehow it didn't fit into the Republican contract on America. No gift reform, no campaign finance reform. Those things got left out, to be done later, of course.
The gentleman, well, we're delighted to be welcomed by the congressman from New York City, from Brooklyn, Major Owens. Mr. Owens?
Yeah, I want to congratulate the gentleman for holding a special order in response to the latest developments with respect to the endorsement of the balanced budget concept by the President and your present discussion of taxes, of revenue. I hope that we're going to have much more of this kind of discussion and invite the American people to take a very close look at revenue, measures to produce revenues and taxes. We have erred, certainly in the Democratic Party, and maybe Mr. Sanders, the independents have erred too, by not talking enough about taxes. We leave that to other people, and we have a situation where when bills related to revenue, taxes, have come to the floor of the House, it's always been from the Ways and Means Committee, and the rule always was that you could not make a single amendment. They always came and you voted it up or you voted it down. So the Ways and Means Committee has been in charge of tax policy for the Congress for the last 20, 30 years. And they are responsible for something which the American people ought to take a very close look at, and that is the swindle, the great swindle of the American taxpayer by reducing the amount of the tax burden borne by the corporate sector, reducing it drastically from almost 40%, 39.8% in 1943, down to 8% in 1980, and then presently it's 11%, even after President Clinton has taken steps to get it back up. So you look at that, on the one hand, they've reduced the corporate income taxes, and the individual taxes have gone up from 27% in 1943 to the present 44% in 1995. So there's been a great swindle in terms of reducing the revenue, the portion of the revenue burden borne by the corporate sector and raising the portion borne by the individuals. While we're on the subject of balanced budget, let's invite all of America to take a very hard look at the way we derive our revenues.
The gentleman is absolutely right. Between 1979 and 1989, when the rich were getting richer, the number of taxpayers reporting adjusted gross incomes of $200,000 a year or more grew by 8 times. A lot more people were getting rich. Meanwhile, according to the House Ways and Means Committee, tax savings in 1992 for families in the upper 1% income bracket tax savings totaled $41,886, a result of the drop in the effective tax rate for those families, it's the upper 1%, from 35.5% in 1977 to 29.3% in 1992. So the point that the gentleman makes is absolutely right. When we talk about why we have a $4.7 trillion debt, how can we not talk about the huge tax breaks given to the wealthiest people in America and to the largest corporations?
If the gentleman would yield for a moment, perhaps we can bring the discussion to what we're confronted with today. The House Republican budget starts out moving the United States toward a balanced budget by first further reducing taxes on the most wealthy, those who earn over $100,000 a year, and on the largest, most profitable corporations by $353 billion. So they first start with here we are, we're in the hole, we're all agreeing we need to have fiscal responsibility, move toward a balanced budget. First thing we do is we make the hole $353 billion deeper in order to benefit people who earn over $100,000 a year, and in order to give further tax relief to the corporations, and as the gentleman from New York pointed out, who are paying taxes at about, what was it, about a quarter or a third of the rate in the
Okay, let's repeat
40s?
that one again. Let me just ask the gentleman this question. Every day we hear about the crisis of our national debt. Is that what we hear every day? And our children and we all understand the importance of that. Is the gentleman suggesting that one of the major ways the Republicans are proposing to deal with our national debt is to give huge tax breaks? Is that a strategy to deal with the deficit and the debt?
We're revisiting trickle-down economics, the theory that if we give those people who are much smarter than we are, who earn over $200,000 a year and control these corporations more money, that they will create more jobs and the effects will trickle down. We are right back to the failed trickle-down policies of the mid-'80s. Those policies brought us record debt, record deficits, and as the gentleman pointed out, consistently caused a decline in the standard of living of middle-income families and wage-earning Americans.
If I might, let's review again who is getting those tax breaks. Obviously, one would think that if one decided to give tax breaks, and that's a debatable issue, clearly you would give it to the working people, the people who are in most trouble. Interestingly enough, if you look at the Republican budget, the wealthiest 1%, the people who need the tax breaks the least, are getting more in tax breaks than the bottom 60%.
Well, you're talking at the top, people who are generally the people in the top will be getting breaks that average up to $40,000 off of their taxes compared to $500 for a $40,000 a year family. This is not restoring equity to the tax system.
What's important for the American people to understand, and you ought to listen carefully and ought to demand from your congressman an explanation as to why is this happening? Why are you giving these tax breaks to the rich? why are you continuing the trickle-down theories of Reaganomics? Ronald Reagan's explanation, he had an explanation, and he gave it, and it's been proven to be totally wrong, that if you will give the appropriate tax cuts and tax breaks to the rich and to the corporations, their investments will create activities which will in turn create jobs. The investment activities will create jobs. Now here's where it is obvious that the empirical evidence showed it didn't happen under Reaganomics. It won't happen now either. We have wealth being accumulated in this country at unprecedented rates. The very rich are getting rich faster. Wall Street is booming. Wall Street is booming. And yet, no new jobs are being created. The jobs are going the other way. You have a jobs economy over here, and you have a Wall Street economy over here. And there's no relationship between the two, because as they invest more money, they can buy more automated equipment, or they can take their operations overseas, and they can manipulate in many, many different ways to make additional money off their investments without creating jobs. They're downsizing the jobs, they're streamlining, they're doing all kinds of things to press the American workers into a situation where they have no bargaining power. We're all going to end up being, suburban peasants or urban serfs, who have no choice almost because of the tremendous power these corporations have. The power we have as voters in this democracy is to demand that we begin to reverse this by forcing those who are making the wealth to pay more into the general funds that are needed in order to promote the general welfare and to provide for the public sector investments that will begin to drive the economy in a different direction.
The gentleman makes a very important point. The theory of giving tax breaks to the rich and to large corporations is if we give them tax breaks, they're going to reinvest in our communities and create decent-paying jobs. Sounds like a good theory. Unfortunately, all of the facts indicate that that theory is totally bogus, given the reality of what's happening. The gentleman from New York points out that major corporation after major corporation, the same ones that got huge tax breaks in the early 80s, the same ones the Republicans want to give huge tax breaks to now, what they have done is use those tax breaks to develop more automation. Major corporation after major corporation has laid off huge numbers of American workers. We're talking about millions of workers. And the other thing that they have done after we give them tax breaks is they invest abroad. They're investing in Mexico. Why do you want to pay an American worker $10 an hour, $15 an hour? You got a Mexican work for $1 an hour. What about China? How many Americans know that American corporations are investing tens of billions of dollars in China? You know what the wages are in China? 20 cents an hour. Last year, American corporations invested $750 billion abroad. Every mayor in America, every governor in America is begging on their hands and knees for corporations to reinvest in their communities, and these corporations get the tax breaks and they go abroad.
With the gentleman yield for a moment there, I'd like to point out that it was the esteemed Speaker of the House of Representatives who said that, in fact, we can't raise the minimum wage for the American working people because of our competition with Mexico. Of course, the Speaker supported the North American Free Trade Agreement, which I bitterly opposed and have had introduced legislation to repeal. I mean, just to recap on that, we were told it would create jobs in America. We were told that it would help the United States balance of trade. It would stabilize Mexico. Those of us who opposed it said, we believe we'll export jobs, we believe that we'll run a trade deficit with Mexico, and we believe that it will further destabilize Mexico. We were a little bit wrong because we couldn't realize that not only would it destabilize Mexico, continue the current corrupt system, that the peso would be devalued and the standard of living would fall by nearly 40% for every Mexican worker, that we would be running already this year. We're headed toward a $20 billion trade deficit with Mexico, which means that we will export 400,000 jobs to Mexico this year. But we never could have predicted that we would have to pay for the privilege of exporting our jobs to Mexico, which is what we're doing today with the bailout of the speculators who were so actively engaged in the Mexican economy and the few billionaires who run the Mexican economy and the corrupt political system they have. U.S. tax dollars are going to bail those people out. So we are paying for the privilege of running a trade deficit and exporting our jobs to Mexico. And the Speaker tells us that we can't raise the minimum wage for the American workers because they have to compete with the Mexican workers whose salaries just went down by 35%. And then on another day he said, by the way, the competition is in South China. So apparently we've already quickly moved from Mexico because those people are earning as much as $1 an hour, and now suddenly the American workers not only have to compete with them, the American workers are now supposed to compete with slave labor in China or those who are paid at the rate of 20 cents an hour.
Could the gentleman just linger for a minute on Mexico? And I hope that, again, every American voter ought to be angry. There's good reason to be angry, but we ought to focus and direct our anger in ways which are more effective and at the real source of the problem. I said before, we ought to be angry at the fact that corporations have gotten away with so much over the last 30 years, and certainly they've dropped all the way down to now paying 11% of the tax burden, while individuals and families are paying 44% of the tax burden. That's enough to be angry about. But Mexico in particular, it ought to make us turn red, all of us, with anger, because we first have NAFTA, a situation which was created by a sweeping change in public policy that created a situation which was, even under the best circumstances, going to hurt the American workers. It was designed to make the rich get richer, to have the corporations have every advantage in terms of export, import, exploitation of cheap labor in Mexico. All of it was designed to help those same people that the Republican tax cut is going to help. And on top of the inevitability of it hurting working people comes an additional burden of us having to bail out the Mexican economy to the tune of $20 billion. It is enough by itself for you to be angry at the government. Now, when I say government, I don't mean just President Clinton. I mean also the leadership of the House and the Senate, and all of those great majority of the members of Congress who went along with NAFTA and GATT. You ought to be angry. You ought to talk to them about the mistakes that they've made, and they have to reverse those mistakes. They have to now focus on an economy which is going to promote the general welfare of America. The Japanese are being criticized for their protectionist trade policies, their closed society. The Japanese protects its middle-class society. It almost has no poverty class. As a result of the fact, it takes the necessary actions to guarantee that everybody's going to be able to make a living. So be it. Let the United States also, as voters, we can demand a series of public policy decisions which lead to the protection of our way of life, of our standard of living, and we can make contributions to the rest of the world in terms of holding up that model. Unfortunately, we have let the situation deteriorate to the point where we are headed rapidly for the bottom in terms of the standard of living of our workers, while Germany has the highest standard of living in the world, and I'm not criticizing that. The German worker, gets 6 weeks vacation. He gets family and medical leave off with pay. They have very high wages. I'm not criticizing them for that. It could happen here if we had a different set of public policies and we took control of our government. Every person who votes has an opportunity to have an impact on this public policy, and we should stop sitting by as spectators while the Ways and Means Committee and the White House and GAFTA, NAT, and all these other institutions weigh down upon us and force our standard of living down.
The gentleman makes
yes, sure.
two, I think, very, very important points. He explains that in America we are angry, and we have a good reason to be angry. But what the Rush Limbaughs of the world and the Republican leadership are trying to do is getting us all angry at each other. Every day it seems like there's a new group that we're supposed to hate. On Monday, I suppose we're supposed to hate the gays, And on Tuesday, we're supposed to hate the immigrants. And on Wednesday, we hate the welfare recipients. And Thursday, it's Anti-Black Day. And Friday, it's Anti-Woman Day. And on it goes. And yet, we are never focusing on the real group of people who hold the power in this country. And that is the very, very wealthy and the large multinational corporations who contribute huge sums of money to members of this Congress, who control this Congress and write the agenda for this Congress. And I think what all of us are saying in different ways, that maybe the time is long overdue when the middle class and the working people and the low-income people and the women and everybody else began to stand together and say that there's something wrong when our standard of living is going down and when the richest people get richer. The gentleman from New York made a good point. There are some people who still hold the illusion that we are number one in the world. We are the wealthiest country in the world. Not for working people, you're not. Germany, manufacturing workers in Germany now make 25% more than our manufacturing workers. Do you know why corporations from Germany and Scandinavia and Europe are investing in America? Cheap labor. We now can give them cheap labor. That's what's happening. And that is a real shame. What I would like to do now with my colleagues, if we might, we want to talk about the budget, the Gingrich budget, the Clinton budget. We're trying to give some background as to how we got to where we were. We talked about the fact that one of the reasons for the national debt, huge tax breaks for the rich and the largest corporations. There's another area that is worthy of at least some discussions given the vote today, and that is the role of military spending. Remember, $4.7 trillion debt. Obviously, the Cold War is over. Soviet Union does not exist. Clearly, I would imagine that today, having voted on the military budget, there was a major decrease in military spending. Is that correct, Mr. DeFazio?
Well, the gentleman knows that, in fact, the second part of the major part of the plan of the new Republican majority to bring us to a balanced budget after the massive tax break for the wealthy and the large corporations is to increase military spending. It's obviously an absurd formula. You can't spend another $92 billion over the next 7 years on the military to build weapons that even now the Pentagon says it doesn't want, it doesn't need, and have no practical purpose. The House voted this week with very little exposure to the public. This bill was brought forward under a very restrictive rule, and we were allowed one amendment on the B-2 bomber, $1.5 billion each for bombers which the Pentagon says have no purpose in the post-Cold War world, and yet the House of Representatives voted by a substantial margin, lockstep on the Republican side, followed by a number of Democrats, to build another 10 B-2 bombers at the cost of $1.5 billion each, something the Pentagon says it doesn't want, it doesn't need, it can't use. In addition to putting more money into the Star Wars fantasy. We've spent $36 billion on Star Wars since Ronald Reagan first unveiled this vision in the early 80s. And we've got just 1 second, and I'll yield back, and he can yield. $36 billion on Star Wars, and you know what the net result is of the money on Star Wars? One faked test over the Pacific Ocean, and the Pentagon admits to it. They faked it up. They couldn't hit the incoming missile, one missile, not a fleet of missiles. They couldn't hit it, so they put explosives in it. They pushed a button, it blew up, and they said to the world, look, Star Wars works. It doesn't work, and it's a very expensive fantasy. I'd yield back to the gentleman from Vermont.
I just wanted to linger for a moment on the B-2 bomber. The cost of building plus operation, I think it's a $31 billion price tag over a 5-year period. Now, the B-2 bomber, the Air Force said, we don't want it, we don't need it. It actually is counterproductive because it'll mean funds will be spent for an item that we don't need, and they'll be taken away from many items we do need. So the Air Force says that. The Joint Chiefs of Staff says that we don't need it. We don't need it, we don't want it. The Secretary of Defense, we don't need it, we don't want it. It's not in the President's budget. He doesn't need it, he doesn't want it. I'm sorry, but I think every voter out there ought to ask their congressman, did you vote to continue the funding for the B-2 bomber? And if you did vote to continue the funding for the B-2 bomber, in light of the fact that all of the experts, all of the military, everybody says we don't want it, we don't need it, it's a waste, then you have no right to talk about wasting government ever again. You have no right. That was a perfect example. Why would anybody vote for the B-2 bomber? It is the worst kind of pork. It is pork from the military-industrial complex, the people who have been absorbing much too much of our budget over the last 20 years. It is pork, pork, pork. It will generate a profit for the people who manufacture the bomber. It'll generate a profit for the stockholders who have invested in that corporation. It'll generate some jobs for some workers, but you could create 3 times as many jobs for $31 billion in the civilian sector if you choose to spend the money to create jobs than you can create by building B-2 bombers.
If the gentleman will yield. Okay. So I want to keep the discussion moving in this direction. All of us, the 3 of us and almost everybody in the Congress, recognizes that we have a very serious deficit problem, very serious national debt. But what we are talking about and wondering about is how do you move to lower the deficit when you give huge tax breaks to the rich, when you expand military spending, despite the fact we don't quite know who our enemy is, when you build planes that the Pentagon doesn't want. But if you're going to move toward a balanced budget in 7 years, as Mr. Gingrich wants, or 10 years, as the President wants, something has got to give. If you give tax breaks to the richest people in America, you're going to have to cut someplace. If you build $31 billion of B-2 bombers that the Pentagon doesn't want, you're going to have to cut someplace. Let's briefly talk about some of the areas where there will be cuts, okay? Medicare. Mr. DeFazio, what are they doing to Medicare in order to give tax breaks to the rich?
It's interesting. You know, of course, we had a lot of discussion of health care here last year, and we had considerable opposition on the Republican side of the aisle, and they said there was no problem with the health care system. It didn't need a federal fix. They didn't mention Medicare as being in deep trouble or being bankrupt. They came up with a contract on America to run for election. There's nothing in there about health care or Medicare. Earlier this year, we passed emergency legislation, the recession legislation, and the emergency spending for disasters. No mention of a disaster in pending in Medicare or a need for changes in Medicare. It was only after legislation had been adopted to cut taxes predominantly for people who earn over $100,000 a year and the largest, most profitable corporations by $350 billion that suddenly we found that we needed to reduce Medicare spending by nearly $300 billion. A cynical person would say there was some linkage between the sudden need to reduce Medicare spending and the huge tax giveaways. Of course, that's denied. They want to reduce Medicare by $300 billion in order to improve the program for seniors. The same seniors now who can't afford prescription drugs, if they can afford the copayment to go to the doctor and get the prescription. We're going to improve the system with no plan, but just by reducing it by $283 billion over the next 7 years.
So what we are talking about, again, please follow the discussion, huge tax breaks for the rich, significant increase in military spending, major cutbacks in Medicare, which will undoubtedly mean that elderly people who today can't afford the cost of health care will have to pay more out of their own pockets, major cutbacks in Medicaid, which will impact on the elderly and the poor, major cutbacks in veterans programs. Now, I always get a kick out of here. Whenever there's a war, everyone tells us how much they love our soldiers and the veterans. But let's be clear. In the Republican budget and in Clinton's budget, we're talking about many billions of dollars in cutbacks for our veterans. Many of the people who fought in World War II defeated Nazism. The VA needs more help, not less money. Also, we are talking about major cutbacks in student loans and in education. I know that Mr. Owens and his community very concerned about the high cost of education. We want our people to get a college education. What does this budget do to the ability of your constituents and mine to get a college education?
Well, New York City has a long tradition of having education available at higher education level for great masses of students. New York City has been a place where large numbers of immigrants have come in and found opportunity. Our City University was established at the height of the Depression. So we were able to maintain City University during the Depression, and now we're saying we can't do it. We have to increase the tuition costs. First of all, for years there was no tuition at all, and then we imposed tuition, and now we have to increase the tuition costs because we're getting less aid from the federal government and less aid from the state government. So at a time when the society is far more complex than ever before, at a time when we're stating clearly that any person who does not have a higher education is at great risk in terms of being able to be employed for most of his life. And on the other hand, those who do have a higher education, statistics and studies have shown they can be employed, they put back into the economy, they give back to the government through the payment of income taxes, they are more productive citizens. All of those things are highly desirable, and yet in the Republican budget, they go so far, not only do they make it more difficult for college students by adding to the burden of their college loans, they eliminate the Department of Education also totally. The elimination of the Department of Education means you have no coordinated approach to education in a situation where education becomes more important every day. And I'd just like to backtrack for just a minute to make a comment on Medicaid. Very little is being said about Medicaid because it is assumed that Medicaid is for the poorest people in the country. Therefore, Medicaid has no political clout. We're just going to dump them overboard. The Republicans are proposing to take away the entitlement to Medicaid. Entitlement means that everybody who gets sick, who's eligible, because they do have to pass a means test and they have to be income eligible, that person is guaranteed that they will have assistance from the government for their health care on Medicaid once they qualify. To take away that entitlement means that if people get sick near the end of the budget cycle, they'll be told by the state that there just is no more money. Medicaid is being cut more drastically than Medicare, and Medicaid is not just a program for the poorest families. 2/3 of the Medicaid funds go to the elderly and to the disabled. Many people who start out as middle-class citizens, when they get ill and are ill over a period of time, they are forced to spend so much money until they end up in nursing homes, and those nursing homes are paid for by Medicaid. The largest percentage of Medicaid funds are going to nursing homes. So we are not, and I hope that, the voters in general frown on creating a second-class health care system for poor families, but you're not just hitting poor families in that second-class health care system. You're hitting people who will drop out of the middle class and become nursing home patients, and Medicaid will have to pay that bill.
Just on the education issue, which the gentleman raised, we adopted in the last Congress an innovative idea. That is, why not have the schools make direct loans to the students, take out the banks as middle persons. The banks have been getting very high rates of interest for loans that have no risk. The idea is you get interest because of risk. The president of the University of Oregon at the time did calculations, and he said that for the same amount of federal money, we could give another 600,000 students full entitlement to student loans if we just took the banks and the bank profits out. The federal government lends the money through the schools, and the federal government knows how to collect money. They know where everybody is. So I'm not worried about defaults, but you know what? The Republican budget wants to do away with direct student loans and put the banks back in the middle. That means take away the loans of 600,000 students so that the banks can make a guaranteed profit on a risk-free loan backed by the federal government. That's just one more form of corporate welfare, and that, I think, segues us back into what is a better vision for a balanced budget. And I just like to, I'm going to have to leave the floor, and if I could just lay out a couple of thoughts, and then I'll yield to the gentleman. The idea that we've talked about earlier, which is that the largest, most profitable corporations aren't carrying their fair share, that foreign corporations are virtually paying no taxes in this country, that the largest gold mining operations in the United States on public lands are foreign-owned and paying no taxes in the United States of America. There are estimates that there's $150 to $200 billion a year, credible estimates that come from the far right, the Cato Institute, to the Progressive Policy Institute, that say there's about $150 to $200 billion a year of corporate welfare out there, and if we went after just a fraction of that, we would not have to see any of these cuts in order to get to a balanced budget. Just a fraction of those revenues linked to reductions in military spending would move us dramatically in the direction we need to go. I yield back to the gentleman.
Well, I applaud the gentleman's remarks. He's absolutely right, and I know the three of us and many others have been trying to focus this Congress on the issue of corporate welfare. You know, when most Americans think about welfare, they say, oh, my money is going to those poor people. Wake up. More money is going to the rich and to the large corporations in terms of federal subsidies and tax breaks that are going to the poor people. Mr. Owens, did you want to, I know you've been working on the issue of corporate welfare. I know you have some thoughts on it. Do you want to share some of those?
Again, the burden that was borne by corporations in 1943 was 39.8% of the total tax burden. The burden that corporations have, the portion of the tax burden that corporations bear now is only 11%. Individuals started in 43 with 27%, and now individuals are paying 44% of the tax burden. That's a fact that I can't emphasize too much. And I think Mr. DeFazio has said before that one way you can gain a large amount of revenue, I don't have the actual figures before me, but they were all listed in the Congressional Black Caucus budget. We listed specifically where we would find the money, which added up to almost $600 billion over a 7-year period. $600 billion that would have come from such items as one mentioned by Mr. DeFazio. If you change the way you tax foreign corporations, if you just make a change from a tax credit that's utilized in one point and make it a tax deduction, you gain enormous amounts of money. If you close a lot is still there. It's been there forever. There are numerous loopholes that have been developed because the corporations have literally owned the Ways and Means Committee, and the Ways and Means Committee, whether it's Democrat or Republican, has had the same approach of being the servant of corporations. So down, down, down has gone their portion of the tax burden, while the individual's portion has gone up.
Right. Let me just pick up and give you a few more examples. We talk about federal aid to housing. And the leadership here in the Congress says, we can't afford affordable housing anymore. And in fact, one of the lovely proposals was to cut back on federal aid to homeless people with AIDS. We just can't afford to provide any money to keep those people alive. But let's talk about another interesting federal housing program, and that's the mortgage interest deduction up to mortgages of $1 million. Now, most of the people that I know in the state of Vermont, they don't have $1 million homes. Maybe it's a $100,000 house, maybe it's a $200,000 house. That's true throughout America. But interestingly enough, if you got $1 million mortgage, the house can be worth more than $1 million, you can deduct the interest on $1 million of your mortgage. Who gets that benefit? Think it's low-income people? No. Middle-income people? No. Obviously, upper-income people who own the large houses are the major beneficiaries of that program. That's called welfare. But that's a different type of welfare because you're helping the wealthiest people in America. Another program that I have paid a little bit of attention to is called OPIC, O-P-I-C, the Overseas Private Investment Corporation. Mr. Owens and I were talking about the decline in our economy for working people. We are seeing corporations investing $750 billion abroad while they're throwing American workers out on the street. The American taxpayers would be delighted to know that they subsidize this federal agency, OPIC, $50 million a year. And what does this agency do? Its main job is to help American corporations invest in politically unstable countries abroad. So you're having AT&T, DuPont, GTE, Ford, largest corporations in America were busy throwing American workers out on the street, getting taxpayer help in order to invest in politically unstable countries. And if there is revolution or civil war in those countries, we have provided insurance for them and in fact have a $6.3 billion insurance liability. And on it goes. The point that Mr. DeFazio, Mr. Owens, and I are trying to make is that we can move toward a balanced budget, but we can do it in a fair way. You don't have to savage Medicare, Medicaid, Head Start, WIC, student loans, food stamps, and many, many other programs that tens of millions of Americans depend upon. One of the programs that the Republican leadership has proposed to eliminate is the LIHEAP program. It provides fuel assistance for low-income people. 40% of the recipients are senior citizens. In my state of Vermont, it gets pretty cold in the winter, 20 below zero, 30 below zero. We have a lot of low-income senior citizens can't afford the money for oil and gas to heat their homes. Eliminated. But we can continue to provide an enormous amount of money for corporate welfare.
I just want to go back to the corporations' swindle in terms of their reduction of their share of the tax burden over the years, and mention that if you change the way you tax investments, income from investments, and the way you tax capital gains, which they're always trying to change, of course, the Republicans want to lessen the rate on these items. But why, they say, the Bible says man shall earn his living by the sweat of his brow. Those people who really sweat to earn their living, they are charged the highest rate. They're taxed at a higher rate than the people who never sweat. They make investments and they sell and buy items and they make enormous profits. And that income is taxed at a much lower rate than the income earned by the guy out there in the plant and who goes to work every day. Why? What is the justification? There's no justification except that the people who make the investments and who have the greatest gains from capital gains, they have the power. They have the power, and public policy allows them to be taxed at a rate which is much smaller than the rate of the person who works hour by hour for wages. The wage earner has seen his taxes go up tremendously over the last 12 years. It's almost, they don't call it taxes, it's in the payroll tax, it's in the Medicare. There are various ways in which the take-home pay of the wage earners have been drastically reduced. At the same time, we've had all these various programs to subsidize and to help increase the income of people who earn their income from investments and from the sales of capital gains. We can tax. Just enormous amounts of money can be realized by changing the way we tax the capital gains.
Gentleman is absolutely right. What we have here is the Robin Hood proposal in reverse. We take from the middle class and working people and we give to the very, very wealthy. I think the main point that we wanted to make this evening is that we also are concerned about a $4.7 trillion national debt and the very high deficit that we have. But we think that it is extraordinarily unfair to move toward a balanced budget on the backs of the middle class, the working people, and the low-income people, when at the same time we are giving huge tax breaks to the wealthiest people in this country, expanding military spending at a time when we don't need to do so. So our hope is that the American people begin to focus on this issue and demand a little bit of justice in this Congress so that we can deal with the budget and with our deficit in a fair and reasonable way.
I would like to close on an upbeat note. America has a great future. Civilization in the Western world has a great future. Science and technology now drive wealth in the world. And the more educated people we have, the more we build on the base of science and technology, the faster the wealth will increase. The great injustice is that only a few people share in the benefits of this science and technology. It was created by people whose names we never know, by people whose names we do know, but they never derived any direct wealth from it, and we built on it. And a lot of wealth, a lot of science and technology has been created by the American taxpayers. Many of the investments that are being made so profitably now on Wall Street related to the telecommunications industry, the computer industries, those were built upon research and development done by the military using the money of the American taxpayers. All of us have a stake in this wealth that's being created by science and technology. The future of the world lies in this direction. And if we focus on education and increase the number of educated people in the country, we can generate enough wealth to be able to meet all of the needs of all Americans. If we use new revenue techniques, more creative techniques for getting revenue, so that we derive the revenue from the areas where the greatest increases in wealth are taking place, then we can always meet all of the needs of all Americans without pain and suffering. I look forward, I think we can look forward to the future and not see a doomsday scenario of inevitable ongoing deficits forever and ever, or suffering by the American people as a result of trying to reduce the deficit.
I thank the gentleman from New York for his thoughts, and I thank the gentleman from Oregon. What we are fighting for is an America which will provide well for all of our people, and not an America in which the rich get richer and most of the people see a decline in their standard of living. I thank the gentleman. I yield back the balance of my time.